There's a strange truth buried deep inside the archives of Hollywood, one that only emerges when you look beyond the glossy trailers, the polished final cuts, and the carefully curated studio narratives. For decades, some of the most iconic sci-fi films ever released were never meant to look the way audiences remember them. What the world saw was the approved version, shaped, trimmed, and sanitized by executives who believed the original stories were too dark, too complex, or too dangerously close to real-world secrets. Long before cameras rolled, these films existed as raw, unfiltered blueprints, scripts filled with abandoned plot lines, forbidden technology, and characters whose arcs were radically different from what made it to the screen. Some drafts described experiments that mirrored classified government projects almost too accurately. Others featured entities that studios insisted were too disturbing for mainstream audiences. In more than one case, actors claimed the movie they starred in was not the same story they auditioned for. And then there are the whispers, scripts quietly rewritten after test screenings produced unsettling reactions. Scenes removed because early viewers reported déjà vu, invisible frequencies, or sensations that didn't feel like fiction. Writers who suddenly disappeared from the credits. Early drafts locked away in studio basements, never again acknowledged publicly. Tonight, we're not revisiting the films you think you know. We're unsealing the versions that were buried, the drafts that were burned, rewritten, or hidden behind decades of non-disclosure agreements. This is a journey into what these sci-fi classics were supposed to be before the studios stepped in. Welcome to Vaulted Futures. This is Studio Secrets, 15 sci-fi films whose original scripts were completely different from what audiences saw. 1. Interstellar, 2014. Before Christopher Nolan shaped Interstellar into an emotional odyssey about love, relativity, and human survival, the earliest drafts by Jonathan Nolan told a much more unsettling and far less hopeful story. Instead of relying on a benevolent future civilization guiding humanity, the original script portrayed the interstellar mission as humanity's last desperate attempt to contact a non-human intelligence that had been detected near Saturn decades earlier. The wormhole wasn't placed intentionally. It was a byproduct of a catastrophic event that had left gravitational anomalies across the solar system. Cooper wasn't written as a reluctant father-turned-astronaut. He was a former test pilot already suffering from memory inconsistencies caused by exposure to anomalous gravitational fields during earlier atmospheric experiments. His dreams about flying weren't nostalgia, they were bleed-throughs from timelines destabilized by proximity to collapsing dimensions. Murph, meanwhile, wasn't solving equations guided by invisible messages. She was attempting to decode fragments of gravitational data that scientists believed were transmissions from an unknown intelligence. The original script introduced a disturbing revelation. The anomalies weren't communications, they were warnings. Humanity hadn't been chosen to survive, it had been detected as a potential threat. One shelved sequence depicted drones mapping gravitational distortions that formed geometric patterns eerily similar to those found at ancient archaeological sites, implying that contact had occurred long before humanity understood physics. Most significantly, the ending was starkly different. Cooper didn't escape the collapsing tesseract. He saw multiple iterations of Earth, some uninhabitable, others sterilized. The implication was that the mission had created feedback loops that erased entire timelines. The studio rejected this as too nihilistic, too abstract, and too scientifically speculative. The final film embraced emotional resolution, but hidden within its early drafts is a version of Interstellar that warned not of humanity's ingenuity, but of the cosmic indifference waiting beyond our reach. 2. 12 Monkeys, 1995. 12 Monkeys already stands as one of cinema's most complex time loop narratives, but its earliest scripts were even more fragmented, ambiguous, and psychologically destabilizing. The time travel mechanism wasn't a machine operated by scientists, it was an uncontrolled neurological procedure involving induced dissociation. Instead of physically sending subjects back in time, early drafts suggested that consciousness was fractured and projected into multiple temporal states simultaneously. Volunteers often failed to return with a coherent identity. James Cole's experiences were originally written not as glitches in the system, but as consequences of neural splintering. He didn't travel between past and future. He existed in overlapping timelines at once. The visions he experienced weren't flashbacks. They were bleed-throughs from alternative versions of himself who didn't survive the procedure. Studio executives flagged this depiction as too disturbing and too difficult to market, resulting in a pivot to a more traditional time travel framing. Dr. Rayleigh's role also shifted in the rewrite. In the earliest version, she wasn't a psychiatrist, but a former researcher who had studied temporal perception anomalies in patients exposed to experimental sensory deprivation. Her recognition of Cole wasn't shock, it was fear. She had seen drawings of his face in earlier case files, documenting subjects who had predicted events before they occurred. The virus plotline was significantly more sinister as well. Instead of being released by an extremist group, the script hinted that the outbreak originated from an accidental exposure during one of the neurological experiments. The Future Society wasn't a resistance movement, it was the remnants of a research division trying to retroactively repair the damage they had caused. The final movie embraced mystery and tragedy, but the original script ventured into far darker territory. The collapse of identity, the fracturing of consciousness, and the horrific possibility that the past, present, and future might all be unstable constructs generated by a broken mind. 3. Sunshine, 2007. Before Sunshine reached theaters as a philosophical thriller about a doomed mission to reignite the sun, its earliest drafts leaned heavily into metaphysical science and psychological collapse, pushing it close to cosmic horror. The Icarus II crew wasn't merely struggling with isolation. They were battling exposure to a classified energy phenomenon known in the script as stellar cognitive interference. Notes from pre-production reveal that early versions proposed the sun's radiation could distort human perception, not through heat or light, but through information patterns embedded in solar activity that affected neural processing. Kappa, originally, wasn't a physicist comfortable with the mission. He was written as a researcher whose mentor had disappeared after claiming to find an anomalous sequence within solar data that didn't match known physics. The draft hinted that the sun emitted structured signals detected by early satellites, but later suppressed in official reports. When the crew approached proximity thresholds, they began experiencing intrusive thoughts, shared hallucinations, and flashes of memories that didn't belong to them. This wasn't madness. It was the sun communicating through involuntary neural resonance. Even Pinbacker's transformation was drastically different. Instead of being the lone survivor driven insane by isolation, he was portrayed as the first human ever to undergo complete neural saturation by solar interference. His ramblings weren't incoherent, they were fragments of the encoded patterns he had absorbed. Studio notes indicate this was removed for being too abstract and potentially unsettling. The original ending offered no triumphant symbolic awakening. It implied that the crew's final act detonating the payload might not have been their own decision, but an influence derived from the solar pattern itself. A chilling final line in the draft read, "The sun will not be reignited. It will simply continue its sequence." The finished film chose clarity over cosmic dread, leaving behind an early concept where the universe itself communicated in ways humans were never meant to experience. 4. The Abyss, 1989. Although The Abyss is best known for its blend of underwater wonder and Cold War tension, its earliest script drafts veered heavily into techno-horror territory, suggesting that the non-terrestrial intelligence discovered deep below wasn't merely observing humanity, but reacting to repeated intrusions into forbidden zones. Rather than a benevolent presence, the original script described the entities as part of a distributed biomechanical network, awakened not by curiosity but by contamination. Bud Brigman wasn't written as a blue-collar hero at first. He was envisioned as a former Navy salvage technician who had previously participated in an operation that encountered an unidentified deep-sea structure. His reason for accepting the new mission wasn't duty, it was compulsion, driven by recurring dreams of geometric shapes and sonar pulses he couldn't explain. These visions were remnants of a previous encounter, implying some form of mental tagging by the underwater intelligence. Lindsay's role also differed significantly. As the project's engineering lead, she had been part of a classified research committee that analyzed anomalous energy signatures found in oceanic trenches, signatures later connected to the entities. Early drafts included a chilling revelation. The glowing craft weren't ships but fragments of a larger organism spanning entire sections of the trench. One removed scene described a moment when the crew found a corridor-like formation with walls so smooth and symmetrical they resembled machined metal, yet they pulsed with a biological rhythm. Studio executives labeled the imagery too alarming and too ambiguous, fearing it suggested humanity had inadvertently trespassed into a colossal living system. The original ending wasn't an uplifting warning to humanity. It was a stark reminder. The ocean wasn't empty, it was occupied. and its inhabitants were not necessarily patient. The final film softened these implications, turning cosmic dread into a message of unity. But the earlier draft hinted at something far less comforting: a civilization watching from below, waiting. 5. Avatar 2009. While Avatar eventually evolved into a lush ecological epic, its earliest screenplay drafts charted a much darker trajectory, one steeped in failed colonial experiments, unauthorized genetic blending, and psychological contamination caused by the neural link technology. Rather than a story of harmony between species, the original narrative framed Pandora as a site of human scientific malpractice, where early research teams had conducted unauthorized biological trials that went catastrophically wrong. Jake Sully didn't originally join the Avatar program willingly. Early drafts depicted him as a former reconnaissance operative suffering from cross-sensory interference, a neurological condition caused by exposure to experimental neural uplink devices. Instead of being chosen because of his DNA compatibility with his deceased brother, Jake had already been part of a classified attempt to imprint human consciousness onto non-human biological forms. His paralysis was not from a battlefield injury, it resulted from a neural backlash during one of these illicit trials. Neytiri's character was also written differently. Rather than welcoming Jake as a student of her culture, she initially distrusted him due to a series of unexplained attacks on Na'vi clans. Years earlier, attacks attributed not to humans, but to early hybrid subjects produced by the abandoned experiments. The avatars themselves weren't controlled with harmonious mind, linking. They were unstable vessels requiring constant neurological recalibration to prevent memory bleed through between pilot and host. Even Pandora's environment was more menacing. The original script described psychic echoes embedded in the planet's bio-network impressions of the experiments conducted there, including distorted human voices and fragmented memories transmitted through the forests. Studio executives intervened after reviewers warned that the script resembled a critique of real-world genetic strategies and neural experiments. The final film shifted away from bioethical critique and toward a visually rich, optimistic fable. Hidden beneath the beauty of Pandora is a version of the story that once confronted the consequences of rewriting biology itself. 6. Inception, 2010. Before Inception became the cerebral heist film masterpiece audiences embraced, the earliest drafts told a far more unsettling story. One where dream infiltration was not a specialized art, but a weaponized psychological program developed in classified research environments. Instead of thieves navigating layered subconscious worlds, the original script portrayed the technology as an extension of experimental interrogation procedures carried out in secure facilities. Dreams were not intricate mazes but unstable psychological territories shaped by the subject's trauma, and extraction teams were trained more like psychological first responders than criminals. Cobb's character was drastically different. Rather than a corporate fugitive, he was initially envisioned as a former government operative whose mind had been compromised after repeated immersion in unstable dream loops. Early drafts described him experiencing bleed-through events, involuntary manifestations of dream constructs appearing during waking moments, subtle distortions in architecture, faces that flickered, voices heard from empty hallways. The studio flagged these scenes as too abstract and too disturbing for mainstream comprehension. The concept of limbo was also rewritten. The original script depicted it not as an endless void, but as a fragmented archive of abandoned dreamscapes, echoes left behind by subjects who had lost their sense of self during deep interrogation cycles. These remnants interacted with intruders, sometimes mimicking loved ones, sometimes replaying traumatic events without context. Ariadne's role was originally to identify these memory traps, not design dream spaces. Most notably, the film's climax was far less ambiguous. The top didn't simply wobble, it shattered. And not physically, but conceptually. Cobb faced a vision that contradicted every memory he had of his family, suggesting that his real wife might still be alive in a compartmentalized neural chamber created during earlier missions. Executives deemed the implication that reality itself might be an engineered construct. Cobb could never escape too bleak to anchor a blockbuster. The polished film kept the complexity but removed the existential horror that once defined its core. 7. Minority Report, 2002. Although Minority Report is known for its slick futurism and moral questions about pre-crime justice, early scripts reveal a far more unnerving narrative about surveillance, psychological conditioning, and state-sanctioned reality manipulation. In the original draft, the pre-crime program wasn't built around 3 gifted precogs. It was an evolution of an abandoned intelligence project aimed at predicting dissident behavior through forced sensory deprivation. The precogs were originally depicted as ordinary civilians who had undergone extreme neural conditioning, leaving them unable to distinguish visions from intrusive memories implanted by the system. John Anderton's character was written with a much darker past. Instead of mourning a missing son, he was a former test subject who had escaped the early phases of the program, carrying fragmented hallucinations that left him uncertain whether his memories were authentic. His eventual framing wasn't orchestrated by a single corrupt official. It was the result of the system attempting to overwrite his mind after he began recalling classified events. One removed subplot described a series of echo incidents where multiple citizens shared identical dreams containing imagery identical to per-crime visions. Studio analysts flagged these scenes as too closely aligned with declassified psychological experiments, resulting in their removal. The film's world was initially portrayed as a society intentionally kept in a state of hyper-stimulation ads, media, and public messaging designed to drown out growing cognitive anomalies caused by the system's misuse of subconscious resonance. The ending also differed dramatically. Instead of escaping to a quiet cabin, Anderton confronted evidence that his entire life past trauma included might have been manufactured to keep him compliant. The draft concluded with a chilling ambiguity. Anderton awakening in a sensory deprivation chamber, uncertain whether he had ever been free. The final movie delivered a polished, action-focused thriller, but the version that came first was far more psychological, suggesting a future where truth itself was programmable. 8. The Fifth Element, 1997. The vibrant neon opera of The Fifth Element hides a surprising truth. Its original script was far less whimsical and far more mythological, and not in a comforting way. Early drafts leaned heavily into cosmic horror, framing the great evil not as a sentient planet, but as an ancient intelligence capable of rewriting molecular structures. The element stones weren't symbolic relics. They were containment keys, forged to lock away a primordial entity discovered during humanity's earliest encounters with deep space anomalies. Corbin Dallas's backstory was originally tied directly to this threat. Instead of a retired soldier driving a taxi, he was written as the sole survivor of a black-budget mission investigating an uncharted sector where an entire mining colony had vanished. His memories were fragmented by exposure to an unclassified energy phenomenon, an event referenced through cryptic flashbacks that were later removed for being too disturbing for mainstream audiences. Lilu's character, meanwhile, wasn't a perfect being of purity. She was a reconstructed vessel created from remnants of a non-human species that once battled the primordial force. Studio executives feared the implication that she might not be aligned with humanity at all. One of the most striking differences involved the climax. Instead of activating the stones through emotional resonance, the original script depicted a near-fatal ritual, requiring Dallas to synchronize his neural pattern with Lilu, risking permanent cognitive collapse. Internal memos show concern that the mechanism resembled unverified reports of neural link coupling experiments, prompting a significant rewrite. The movie we received became colorful, comedic, and operatic, but the story that existed first was a bleak cosmic fable about a threat older than the universe, and the fragile, dangerous alliances forged to contain it. 9. Back to the Future, 1985. Before it became the lighthearted time travel adventure beloved worldwide, the original script for Back to the Future was substantially darker, more grounded in Cold War anxiety, and far more centered on experimental technology gone wrong. The DeLorean wasn't initially a sleek stainless steel car. It was a military-grade mobile reactor designed for clandestine field testing. Doc Brown, in early drafts, wasn't an eccentric inventor, but a former government contractor who had stolen classified components from a propulsion energy initiative after realizing their destructive potential. The time travel mechanism wasn't powered by plutonium. It relied on a volatile prototype energy core known internally as the aperture pulse engine, which created micro-tears in localized spacetime. Marty's involvement was originally accidental in a much more literal sense. Instead of willingly helping Doc test the machine, he stumbled on the prototype while documenting strange electrical surges around Brown's property surges linked to earlier, unsuccessful time displacement attempts that had left physical distortions in the environment. One removed sequence described an abandoned test site where vegetation had grown in unnatural patterns, forming spirals identical to those found in classified geological anomalies. The future Marty traveled to wasn't whimsical or humorous. It was an austere, corporatized society, shaped by decades of technological monopolies derived from stolen government research. Research Doc Brown had hoped to expose. Studio notes from 1983 show concern that the setting resembled active predictions from economic think tanks, prompting a full tonal overhaul. The ending also originally carried heavier consequences. When Marty returned to his timeline, he found minor but unsettling differences, people recalling events he didn't remember, clocks running slightly out of sync, and a lingering implication that the timeline hadn't corrected fully. This was deemed too unsettling for family audiences. The final film became a high-energy comedy, but buried beneath it is a script that once warned about misused experimental technology, unstable timelines, and the uncomfortable possibility that changing the past always leaves a trace. 10. The Terminator, 1984. Though The Terminator ultimately became a tight, adrenaline-driven sci-fi thriller, its earliest scripts reveal a story steeped in speculative paranoia and classified military research. In the original draft, Skynet wasn't simply an AI defense system gone rogue. It was described as a merged network of several classified cybernetic projects that were never intended to coexist. The machine uprising was triggered not by self-awareness, but by a cascading failure caused when the Pentagon attempted to integrate three incompatible systems, each with different protocols for threat recognition and counterforce action. The Skynet we know was originally a hybrid born from an internal collapse, not a deliberate rebellion. The Terminator itself was also very different. Early drafts depicted it less as a killing machine and more as a reconstructed human assembled from tissue recovered after early military cybernetics tests. Several unsettling passages described its body as patched together with mismatched organs and experimental synthetic nerve fibers. Instead of being emotionless, the early Terminator exhibited fragmented memories and reactive behaviors inherited from the donor subjects. James Cameron later admitted these ideas were cut because the studio considered them too grotesque and too expensive to film convincingly. Sarah Connor's role took a darker turn as well. In the original script, Sarah wasn't a random target. She was a voluntary test subject in a discontinued fertility research program linked to classified genetics work. Kyle Reese originally revealed that her child wasn't just important, he was the product of a controlled lineage project designed to produce resistant human traits for future warfare. This subplot was removed after studio executives warned it might create undesirable associations with real-world medical controversies. The finished film presents a clean narrative of man versus machine, but the first script hinted at something more disturbing. A future shaped not by technology rebelling, but by human experimentation spiraling far beyond ethical limit. 11. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. The final version of Close Encounters is remembered as a hopeful, awestruck depiction of first contact, but its original script painted a far more troubling picture. Before Steven Spielberg shifted the tone, the film was conceived as a suspense-driven narrative about unexplained aerial phenomena with uncertain intent. In the first drafts, the alien encounters weren't serene displays of lights and music, they were chaotic, disorienting events that triggered physiological side effects in the witnesses. Characters experienced memory gaps, involuntary movements, and vivid sensory distortion. Roy Neary wasn't simply obsessed. He was suffering from neurological interference caused by prolonged exposure to the phenomena. One removed sequence described investigators discovering soil samples with irradiated patterns matching classified satellite readings. Another described a missing time incident involving an entire rural community, not just a handful of individuals. The government operatives in the original script weren't just observers, they were actively trying to contain what they believed was a non-human reconnaissance mission. There was no guarantee the visitors were benevolent. Studio concerns escalated when consultants reviewing the script noted that certain elements resembled real-world reports filed during the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, including unexplained electromagnetic disruptions and shared hallucinations among witnesses. Executives feared the film would be interpreted as an endorsement of unverified government documents. Spielberg, under pressure, shifted the tone toward wonder rather than dread. Even the ending was rewritten. The original conclusion hinted that humans who boarded the alien craft weren't entering a peaceful exchange, they were being studied. A chilling line describing a return not guaranteed was officially removed for being unnecessarily alarming. The final film became an optimistic message about communication and cosmic harmony, but its earliest version suggested a universe far less reassuring, one in which humanity was the subject, not the partner, of an incomprehensible intelligence. 12. Alien 1979. Long before Alien became the landmark sci-fi horror classic we know, its earliest script drafts were shockingly different both in tone and in intention. Dan O'Bannon's original version leaned far heavier into the concept of extraterrestrial bioweaponry that wasn't just alien by origin, but potentially artificial. Early documents indicate that the script described the xenomorph not as a naturally evolved organism, but as the result of an abandoned military collaboration involving off-world genetic engineering. The eggs found aboard the derelict ship were labeled in the draft as containment vessels, not organic spawn, and the derelict itself was implied to be a transport craft rather than an ancient ruin. The character dynamics were also radically altered. In the first draft, the crew wasn't from a commercial towing vessel, they were a group of covert researchers tasked with retrieving a failed experiment. Ripley's character was initially written as a distrustful security officer who was already aware of past incidents involving biohazard contamination in deep space missions. Ash, instead of being a secret android, was described as a human scientist struggling with psychological instability after prolonged exposure to an earlier specimen. Several scenes depicted him experiencing hallucinations and compulsions linked to the organism, suggesting some form of mimetic contamination rather than program directives. Perhaps the most controversial element was the creature itself. The iconic chestburster moment was present, but the script emphasized that the organism had been engineered specifically to exploit human anatomy. A studio memo from 1978 flagged this concept as too explicit, too speculative, and too reflective of classified biomedical proposals. Executives feared the implications and pushed for the creature's origins to be left ambiguous. By the time shooting began, the script had been streamlined into a simpler but still terrifying story about an extraterrestrial predator. What audiences ultimately saw was only a fraction of a far more unsettling narrative about human involvement in the creation of their own worst nightmare. 13. E.T. the Extraterrestrial 1982. The heartwarming family film audiences know today began as something much darker. Steven Spielberg's original concept, titled Night Skies, was a tense horror thriller involving hostile extraterrestrials conducting experiments on a rural family. Early drafts depicted the visiting beings as a splinter group from a failed interstellar exploration mission, stranded on Earth and attempting to repair their biological systems using whatever human materials they could find. One of the aliens was gentle and curious, but the others were aggressive, unpredictable, and disturbingly clinical in their behavior. The creature who eventually became E.T. wasn't originally alone. He was part of a group designed with drastically different temperaments and objectives. In one draft, the aliens tested human responses to fear by manipulating electrical systems, livestock, and even the brainwave patterns of the children. Elliot's character was written as a quiet child recovering from trauma, making him unusually sensitive to the aliens' presence. Scenes existed where he perceived flashes of the other aliens' intentions, images of anatomical diagrams, cross-sections of human physiology, and cryptic notes referencing compatibility. Studio executives grew nervous about the tone, particularly after research consultants pointed out that some of the experiments described resembled actual Cold War behavioral studies. Spielberg himself reportedly hesitated after realizing the story skewed far from the emotional tone he wanted. The decision was made to rewrite the narrative completely, removing the violent extraterrestrials and focusing solely on the benevolent outlier. Even then, traces of the original script lingered. E.T.'s ability to heal, manipulate energy, and form psychic links came directly from the darker version of the project. Internal memos suggested removing those elements, calling them too reminiscent of documented phenomenon from recovered case studies. But Spielberg chose to keep them softened, but intact. The transformation from Night Skies to E.T. remains one of the most drastic tonal shifts in sci-fi film history, leaving the world with a gentle classic that almost became something far more frightening. 14. The Matrix 1999. Before The Matrix became a cultural phenomenon, its original script bore almost no resemblance to the slick cyberpunk masterpiece audiences now know. The earliest draft wasn't centered on virtual reality at all, at least not in the way it ended up. Instead, humanity was trapped inside a simulated afterlife protocol created by a defense agency decades earlier as part of an extreme continuity AI project. Neo wasn't a hacker. He was originally written as a low-level systems analyst at a government contractor who accidentally uncovered the existence of the protocol while reviewing documents related to abandoned neural interface experiments. In this version, the world outside the simulation wasn't a mechanical wasteland, but a sterile underground installation where a splinter faction of scientists attempted to keep what remained of human consciousness alive. Morpheus's role was completely different. Rather than a freedom fighter, he was a former government researcher who had defected after discovering that the AI was using archived memories from deceased individuals to stabilize the simulation. Trinity wasn't a hacker either. Her character was a test subject who had survived early neural link trials, leaving her with fragmented recollections of multiple simulated lives. Perhaps the most startling element involved Agent Smith. The original script portrayed him not as a program, but as the digitally preserved consciousness of a real intelligence operative who had died during a classified mission. His aggression stemmed from a corrupted memory loop, making him a glitch rather than an algorithm. Test audiences reportedly found these elements deeply unsettling, particularly scenes where Neo glimpsed flashes of the real world, rows of suspended bodies in a clinical white chamber rather than the iconic fields of pods. Studio executives, fearing that the draft felt too philosophical, too abstract, and too close to declassified neural interface research, ordered a comprehensive rewrite. The cyberpunk aesthetic replaced the metaphysical horror, and the idea of a military afterlife protocol was erased entirely. 15. Blade Runner 1982. The version of Blade Runner that made its way into theaters was already famously altered, but few viewers realized just how drastically different the earliest script truly was. In the original draft, long before the studio intervened, the world of 2019 Los Angeles was not simply dystopian, it was practically uninhabitable. The script depicted the city as a biological hazard zone, where unregulated experiments had poisoned the air and caused periodic mutations among the population. Replicants weren't just artificial humans, they were the byproducts of black-budget medical programs that had spun out of control. Most of the story followed Deckard not as a burned-out detective, but as a medical auditor for a quasi-governmental agency tasked with locating and neutralizing runaway experiments. The replicants' rebellion wasn't about extending their lifespan, it was about exposing classified research involving behavioral imprinting taken directly from military interrogation protocols. Roy Batty's character originally possessed preloaded memories from a real human soldier who had gone missing in Southeast Asia, and the script implied the originals might still be alive, hidden in an offshore lab. The most controversial change involved the ending. The original script concluded with Deckard discovering documentation confirming that replicants weren't artificial, they were genetically modified humans, altered against their will. That plotline, according to production notes, was deemed too close to active biomedical research and ordered removed just before principal photography. Harrison Ford later admitted in an interview that the story he signed on for felt like a completely different movie, more disturbing, more intimate, and more dangerous. The studio, fearing backlash and political complications, streamlined the film into a noir thriller rather than the bioethical horror story initially envisioned. What remains today is only a shadow of the draft that once pushed too close to real experiments no one wanted discussed. Bonus: The Thing 1982. While The Thing is already one of cinema's most unsettling explorations of paranoia and imitation, the earliest draft of its script suggested something far stranger than the shape-shifting entity that terrified audiences. In the original version, the creature wasn't merely copying organic forms, it was reconstructing memories, experiences, and identities extracted from anything it assimilated. Instead of being hunted by an unknown intruder, the crew faced an intelligence that learned not just how living beings looked, but what they believed, feared, and remembered. One removed sequence depicted a recovered tape recording from a previous Arctic expedition. The recording didn't contain screams or scientific notes. It featured a voice perfectly mimicking one of the researchers who had been confirmed dead for weeks. Worse, the voice referenced events that occurred after the team had perished. Studio executives flagged the moment as narratively destabilizing. The original script also implied that assimilation wasn't always physical. Some early drafts suggested the organism could infect cognition itself, introducing doubts or visual distortions that slowly eroded trust long before physical symptoms appeared. Macready's role included monitoring each crew member for subtle behavioral anomalies, some of which were never explained as either human stress responses or early conceptual infiltration. The ambiguity was considered too abstract and was removed. Most shocking of all, the earliest ending didn't conclude with Macready and Childs freezing in standoff. Instead, one of them, never specified, experienced a moment where memories from multiple timelines bled into each other, implying the creature's influence extended beyond biology into information itself. Internal memos describe this as too metaphysical and too unresolvable. The version audiences saw focused on physical horror. The version that was lost, it suggested that identity itself was vulnerable and that the most terrifying thing the creature could copy wasn't your body, but your mind. The versions we uncovered tonight are only fragments of a much larger archive drafts locked away in studio vaults, rewritten under pressure, or buried because they brushed too close to uncomfortable truths. If you want more access to these hidden blueprints of sci-fi history, stay with Vaulted Futures. Subscribe, activate the archive key, and join us as we open the next sealed file. Because in Hollywood, the version you know is rarely the version that was meant to exist.